Hi everyone. This video is a very special book review. It is my annual September 11th Memorial Book Review, and this, event is underneath an umbrella of annual book reviews that I do about historical events that happened during my lifetime that had some type of emotional impact or impression on my life. September 11th, I was 12 years old when it occurred, so I have a lot of memories about it, even though I was not physically in New York. I was in Missouri, but I still remember how life changed, how everything changed after that great tragedy. So this year, I believe maybe my third or fourth annual book review, possibly my second, about September 11th, and the more I learn about it, the more questions that I have. In this video, I'm going to be sharing with you what I've read so far in this book. My plan was to read about 3 or 4 books, but I was not able to do that because I have been very busy, and I've also been dealing with 1 or 2 health issues that has been slowing me down a little bit. So I will try my best to be as informative and as thorough as possible in this video. I'm also going to share some of my personal accounts from my memories, and also the account of somebody that I spoke to who was in New York when 9/11 occurred. So the book that we are going to be reviewing is titled Dust, and it was written by Paul J. Leoy. Dust, the inside story of its role in the September 11th aftermath. Now, as I stated, I did not finish this book, but from what I have read so far, it's very informative. It's very scientific as well. The reason I selected this book was last year I was reading a lot about the first responders. And there was one book that really stood out to me, which was titled We're Not Leaving. And it was essentially first-person accounts from first responders who were at Ground Zero, who were at the pile, looking for people to rescue and doing the cleanup. They shared their stories about the health issues that came to them and their loved ones after September 11th occurred. So I wanted to find more books that gave me more information about that, like the small details, what exactly was in the dust. I just wanted to know more. And luckily I found this book on Thrift Books. So before I get into the book and what I've learned so far, let me share with you a little bit about the author, Paul J. Leoy, or Paul James Leoy. So Paul James Leoy lived from May 27, 1947 through July 8, 2015, and he was a United States environmental health scientist born in Passaic, New Jersey. Working in the field of exposure science, he was one of the world's leading experts in personal exposure to toxins. He published in the areas of air pollution, airborne and deposited particles, homeland security, and hazardous waste. Leoy was a professor and division director at the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at Rutgers University School of Public Health. Until June 30th, 2015, he was a professor and vice chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Medicine at Rutgers University. He was Deputy Director of Government Relations and Director of Exposure Science at the Rutgers Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences. He graduated from Passaic High School in 1965 and Montclair State College, today University, in 1969. In 1971, he received a master's degree from Auburn University in physics, and in 1975, an MS and PhD in environmental science from Rutgers University. And it just has this list of all of his accomplishments. When I say this list is long, this list is long. It shows all of his positions that he had as a professor, as a director, of all these different places, the awards that he received. And it says that in his personal life, in 1971, he married the former Jean Yonon and had one son, Jason. Leroy died on July 8, 2015, after collapsing at Newark Liberty International Airport, age 68, of undetermined causes. I'm wondering if his life with, I guess, all of these particles and chemicals and studying caused some type of health issue that caused his death. I'm not trying to speculate, but I don't know why it said undetermined causes. Like, maybe it was a mixture of something. But yes, he was a very, very well-established man, had a lot of awards from his peers, and fortunately, this book that I have was signed by him. You see? Hold on. Yeah, this book was signed by him on 9/11/2011. So it was about 10 years after 9/11 occurred. What I really find interesting about all of my 9/11 books that I either purchase or find at a thrift store, almost every single one of them either came out the year of 9/11 or the year after. And all of them are first editions, or some of them are signed. So I think that's really fortunate of me to find a book that's signed by him now that he has passed away. So rest in peace, Dr. Paul J. Leroy. So we're going to start off with the prologue. And it says, within 24 hours of the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center in New York City, representatives from several governmental agencies asked me about the dust that was released during the collapse of each tower. The thick gray and fluffy dust seemed to be everywhere, settling on all of the animate and inanimate objects in its path. It covered the skin and clothes of many of those who had survived, but who had been trapped in harm's way. You could see it being resuspended in the air after official vehicles drove through Manhattan. What was in that dust and its companion plume of smoke that was moving across Brooklyn and out to the sea? At the time, I didn't know the answer to this question. Now, what I really thought was interesting was when you watch the videos of the people running, it's like the dust just looked like its own monster. Like, for real, like it looked like its own monster. It was moving so fast. And even when you see personal videos, like people caught in it, you see the screen goes black or it's just dark. And everything, just from photos I've seen and video footage I've seen, it was like nighttime. It almost just changed, hid the sun. It was like night. I think one of my most memorable videos that I remember watching of somebody that had survived the dust was, I don't know what this man's name is, but he was like, I'm 64 or 67 or 69, but I can still run. I love that video because he survived. People covered in dust, and this dust wasn't just dust. It was asbestos, it was computer chips, it was human ashes, it was so many different things. This cocktail of poison. So it says, a few days later, colleagues from the Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences Institute, EOHSI, New Jersey, and I were granted access to the area that had quickly become known as Ground Zero. Since I wanted to know what was in the dust, a colleague and I gathered samples for chemical and physical analysis. So, did I mention this book was published in 2010? So, this book was published 2010. As I engaged in this task, I couldn't help experiencing thoughts and emotions that were far from the usual realm of data collection and analytical studies that I had completed or directed throughout my scientific career. He also mentions that after he was doing his studies and analyses, there were people trying to reach him to get the dust samples. He said, I still received a request for a portion of the World Trade Center dust samples. However, because of the age of the samples and possible transformation of the material, I have decided to only honor requests from individuals who want to use them primarily in educational programs or in research as historical artifacts. Since all the major constituents have been identified, any new materials that would be found in samples would not change my overall conclusions about exposures to the World Trade Center dust and its role in the aftermath of 9/11. I don't know how many complete victims there were of 9/11 because there are people essentially still dying from the chemical effects of 9/11. There's people still dying from the mental traumas of being in wars due to 9/11. It's still claiming victims to this day. And I think knowing what we know now, people may start responding to, I guess, not like environmental hazards of a tragedy, more so than they were back then. Like making sure that they're in a place where the air is clean, making sure they're getting some type of clean water and not letting pollutants get into them at all if they are able to do that. It's just sometimes impossible, but nobody at the time really thought about the dust except for a couple of people that were, I guess, initially focused on that, or the people that were in it. Most of us were just concerned about, like, what is going on. There was too much stimuli happening. Just imagine you have people falling from buildings, skyscrapers falling, airplanes crashing, or depending on who you ask, airplanes or holograms crashing or explosive. I really don't know. It was too much to mentally handle in one day. Sometimes when you're going through trauma, you can only handle one trauma at a time. I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's true. It was like all of our worst fears were coming true on that day. Like, it's one thing to watch somebody falling or jumping from a building. That's one trauma. Then you see a building collapse. That's another trauma. Then you see airplanes flying in the building. It's too much. It's too much back to back. So I can see why dust was the last thing on people's minds, because they're still trying to recover from all the craziness that happened before. So he has, dust reflects my personal conclusions and professional recommendations as a result of having assessed the environmental and occupational exposures and the aftermath of that horrific day in American history. It could not have been written before now because it took time to collect and analyze the scientific data that resulted from the collapse of the World Trade Center. Then it took time for me to fully understand the consequences of the policy decisions we made then and put the story into a form that could be understood by those who are not in science or only had limited time to focus on the details. Now, I really tried to read this book. I don't have a scientific brain. So some parts I had to look over and reread again because my artist brain was just like, what? So I had to go back and read slowly just to grasp what he was saying. Even though he did try to say it in the most layman terms that he could, I still, could feel the scientist coming through his writing, of course. Who you are is going to come through your writing. So, it says, okay. This is in chapter 1, and chapter 1 was When Life Changed. And he basically talks about how life was before September 11th. Like, we were so focused on the most minute things. Like, he said the storyline for the U.S. News and World Report cover story for the week of September 3rd, 2001 was about Americans finding ways to achieve happiness, and on the cover was a big yellow happy face. The storyline was how to make yourself happy. Cheer up. We had also just gone through the Y2K scare. Y2K. The New York Yankees had beaten the Mets not quite a year before. Even when you watch commercials from the night before September 11th, they were just basic commercials. Oh, so-and-so's playing a basketball game. Nobody that didn't know saw it coming. Nobody that was not in the know didn't see this coming. And I feel like even though America isn't an innocent country, I feel like the citizens here, most of them, it felt like some type of innocence was stripped away. Or maybe ignorance was stripped away. I really don't know. Something was stripped away because after that, life was not the same. You couldn't travel the same. You couldn't trust people the same. It was just too much going on. It was too traumatizing on a collective scale. But that's all I have to say. I know my life changed that day. I was just like, I had never seen anything like that before in my life. The collapse of the tower and the blizzard of white dust, he said blizzard, released into lower Manhattan was the moment that personalized my efforts to get involved with the aftermath. It led directly to my group's efforts to complete many scientific analyses on dust samples and our attempts to understand human exposures to the dust and smoke during the aftermath. The scientific articles that we publish, which are the basis for this story, are listed in the bibliography, as well as other citations that are referenced throughout the book. The materials provide information on details of scientific observations that we made and are integrated into the individual chapters of this book. So, in this book, he also has photographs that you can look at for reference. So this photograph is the movement of World Trade Center dust throughout southern Manhattan. So look at that. That is huge. Then it says, mapping results from 9/13 aerial photos. There's confirmed dust debris, probable dust tracks, possible dust tracks. And it just shows how it traveled. I wish I could just look at this and really analyze it. It says, the aftermath. The area most directly impacted by the collapse of each tower was Lower Manhattan. Figure 1.3 is a map of this area of New York City that also notes the location where asbestos samples were taken. So this is the map. I don't know if you can see it. Okay. On the evening of the 11th, I began to think about the potential for significant acute exposures to dust for many segments of the population who were in harm's way that day. My concern would eventually prove to be correct. However, my thoughts appeared to be at odds with the way other scientists started to examine the environmental and occupational health issues. They should have just I'm not saying people couldn't, just up and leave, or could just up and leave, but I really believe they really honestly did not know how much true danger they were in health-wise, if that makes any sense, because they were still traumatized by the effects of that day, the events of that day. So I'm assuming that the dust and everything was probably the last thing on people's minds, trying to mentally recover from earlier that day. Some experts seem to be focused on the measurement of materials that usually cause long-term health effects, including asbestos, which, as shown in Figure 1.3, was monitored during the initial days post 9/11. However, in contrast to comments by others, I cannot criticize their initial reactions and response. It was such an overwhelming disaster, and we had no experience with the magnitude and complexity of the World Trade Center aftermath, a major point lost by many in the days and years that followed. On the afternoon of the 11th, I was watching TV and focused on the plume of smoke coming from intense fires. The temperatures were estimated to be well above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And after the initial World Trade Center dust settled, the plume rose above the 16 areas that became known as Ground Zero. If anything was helpful on that day, it was that the heat released by the intense fire pushed the smoke upward about 2,500 feet, and the very steady winds from northwest moved the plume over Brooklyn and out to the sea. I think that's even worse, because now it's in the water. If the plume had hugged the surface, the air in Brooklyn would have been pitch black and barely breathable that entire day. The area would have looked like the surface level atmosphere just after a pyroclastic volcanic explosion. And this is a three-dimensional simulation of the World Trade Center plume on September 11th. Down here. The nature of the particulate matter. At this point, we must place the World Trade Center dust and closely associated concept of particles that will become airborne and contained in the World Trade Center dust into very basic scientific framework. The most important concept to understand is that particles include a very large range of diameters that extend from the size of a raindrop or sand pebble down to sizes that are just clusters of molecules detectable only under the most powerful microscopes. So it wasn't just like one size, he says. It's all different size, all different particles, this whole concoction of poison that you're breathing on different levels. Very scary. To make things even more interesting, particles can be composed of different substances and can have a variety of materials absorbed, stuck on the surface, or absorbed inside. On top of that, particles of different sizes behave differently. That is scary. That is scary. That's why when I reflect back on the accounts of the people who were first responders and we're not leaving, they had such a variety of health issues. It wasn't just one. It was like, oh, I have arthritis. I've started having seizures, and I also have cancer. Oh, yeah, my hair started falling out. I'm paralyzed now. I can't move my feet. I started getting gangrene. All sorts of things happening simultaneously. The larger particles appear to behave like small rocks, falling to the ground quickly, and the smaller particles can behave like large gas molecules. They are capable of staying in the air for long periods of time. Particles can be formed by physical processes and chemical reactions, and they are found in the solid or liquid phase of matter. So particles have very interesting chemical and physical properties that affect the way they behave and have been an important area of my research since the 1970s. And so he goes into details about the particles, the different ones. There's fine particles, there's inhalable particles, inspirable particles, and he has a map of the human lung from particle size, like based off particle size. So this is the inspirable mass fraction. Super coarse particles enter via nose or mouth. So look at this. That's that one. Thoracic mass fraction, inhalable particles, penetration past larynx. Can't you see? Respirable mass fraction, fine particles, accumulation, penetration past terminal bronchioles. See, as you can see, it sounds so scientific. I just can't. I'm trying though. So, fine particles. These they range in size from 0.1, I don't know what this, is this PUM? I don't know what it is, in diameter to up to 2.5 U, whatever this, I don't know what this is. This sign. I don't know what that is. Wait, no. Yeah, this. What is that? These particles can travel deep into the lung. About 20% of the fine particles will deposit in the lung if the particles are breathed in through either the nose or mouth. They are known to be produced by combustion in industrial processes and direct formation from gases that are either produced by human activity or nature. The most common example of the latter is the inhalation of smoke released by a forest fire. God dang. That's messed up. That's very messed up. Second, inhalable particles. They can be described, and I don't know what this number is. Such particles will primarily deposit above the gas exchange region within the bronchial airways and bronchioles, and are associated with the thoracic region of the lung. About 25% or 10% of these particles will deposit in the lung after they are breathed in through the mouth or the nose. These will preferentially be captured at the points where the bronchial tree branches, including about 20 generations of branching. Typical examples of this include dust storms, roadway dust resuspension, and metal grinding. How did people live this long? How? With all of these particles in their lungs. That is so scary. No wonder their bodies fell apart. So another thing about this book is, and I'm not going to try to be too long-winded, but one thing I noticed about this book was there just seemed to be no order. Nobody knew who to answer to. Do I answer to you? Do I answer to you? Do I answer to FEMA? Do I answer to who do I answer to? People also didn't have the proper equipment, and you saw this last year in We're Not Leaving. They didn't have the proper gas masks. They didn't have the proper things to keep their lungs clear, and that's what caused a lot of them to die later on. Here's another picture, the post-blizzard of dust deposited on surfaces in southern Manhattan. This one. Look how dark it is. There was also something else. Okay. It's pictures from the pile. People doing the cleanup. Then he has this picture of 3 workers. And he puts a box around them because he wants to use them as an example. We reviewed many occupational issues, and it was obvious that only a few people were wearing respirators. I took many pictures, but the classic for respirator use on that day was of the 3 rescue recovery workers standing in a row. The first worker was wearing his respirator, the second was wearing it around his neck, and the third had it on his belt. Clearly, the many messages about wearing respirators were not being heeded by all of the workers, and this was even before the controversy about the air being dirty versus clean hit a crescendo on September 18th. He also mentions like there were people saying that the air was clean, everything was fine, the air was clean, but there really had not been a cleanup. There was still dust in the buildings. There had not been a proper cleanup, but they kept emphasizing to people that everything was safe, everything was fine, you can go outside, life is getting back to normal. Reality check. But they knew. They knew what they were doing. They knew they were sending people to an early death. They just didn't care. Especially if you're an expert on how environmental hazards of a tragedy can cause generational harm. Like, look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, even the children from that were affected. Or Chernobyl. Or is it Chernobyl or Chernobyl? Chernobyl. Very, very disturbing. And people will listen to authority figures that they trust. They won't think about it. They're like, oh, well, everything is safe. Okay. Even though the air smells weird, you're just going to listen to an authority figure just because they have power. But, all right. You do you. My impression at Ground Zero, this is somebody, Mike Gottfeld, is there were seemingly a dozen heavy equipment sectors with cranes swinging everywhere, while people were balancing on 45-degree angle beams. I had anticipated that there would be fatal accidents among the rescuers, but it all seemed to orchestrate itself, and in the end there were far fewer events than expected. The one unfortunate aspect of the scene was the lack of coordination among groups, including environmental and occupational health issues. Based on my areas of expertise, the most significant deficiencies were 1. Lack of mandatory use of respirators. 2. No well-defined personal monitoring of the workers. And 3. The lack of a coherent plan for environmental occupational sampling and analysis during the early phases of rescue. Oh, my goodness. Today, however, I still do not understand why many people working or volunteering at Ground Zero or re-entering their homes did not take precautionary measures on their own to prevent inhaling World Trade Center dust. Simple logic would dictate that if you go into an area of high dust loading, you would have some degree of protection. If you experience problems, get some advice on what you need to do. No one has answered this question to my satisfaction, and no one will. However, the same comment can be made about those who do not listen to or fail to heed mandatory evacuation orders during a hurricane. I mean, isn't that what happened during September 11th, though, for real? Because you had people that were leaving the building, or one of the buildings, and the overhead speaker was like, go back to your offices, everything is fine. And people went back to their offices, and that's how they died. And also, I mean, I'm not saying like the average person is just like not scientific or thinks so deeply about things, but maybe in their minds it was just dust. Like maybe they didn't realize it was poisonous dust. They just assumed like, okay, it's dust. But then again, if you're dealing with people that are doing cleanup and working with iron, like, you'd at least be worried about asbestos or some type of metal, but I don't know. Or maybe they were trying to put on a brave face, or they just didn't have the access to that equipment, because a lot of the accounts from last year's book of We're Not Leaving was limited materials. Your clothes got dirty, your mask got filled with dust, you couldn't breathe, so they just didn't wear it because it was just hard to work with such heavy equipment, and so, like, they felt hot. So maybe that's why they didn't do it, because they felt uncomfortable. I don't know. But of course, he would see it from the environmental perspective, because whatever you study the most, whatever you're focused on the most, you will see it through that lens. You know? If you're a conspiracy theorist, you'll see things through a conspiracy theorist lens. If you're a doctor, you'll see it through a medical lens. If you're an artist, you'll see it through an artistic lens. It's just all about your viewpoint. But it's very sad. And he had some pictures that some people tried to take away from him. The further I read about his work, the more I kept seeing people trying to stop his work, which I just don't understand why they would do that. I'm not trying to be super conspiracy theorist, but okay. Then he has a section where it talks about exposure periods. The time course of contact and exposure to dust and other materials. This is in chapter 5. And this is a timeline. And it has the descriptors. There's the pollutants that were in that, and the duration and the material. So here's a picture of people covered in the dust. So what was period 1? Exposure period 1 was the most intense time of exposure for any survivor in Lower Manhattan. It included the collapse of the towers and next 1 to 12 hours. During the time just after the collapse, southern Manhattan was enveloped by an unprecedented high concentration of dust, smoke, and gases. Thus, period 1 resulted in a very intense period of uncharacterized particles and gases affecting residents, commuters, and rescue personnel in southern Manhattan, or to put it simply, all who were in harm's way. Matt Lorber estimated the levels of particles during this period of time to be well above 5,000, and I don't know what UG/M of air. On a typical high pollution day in New York City, particle levels may be only 40 to 50, so this one was 5,000. As intense fires burned post-collapse, the disintegration of the towers left Lower Manhattan with an unprecedented situation. On the surface, it would appear to be one usually not found outside very arid cities, but World Trade Center dust was definitely not as simple as a mixture of desert sand. We had dust smoke from the Twin Towers, depositing on the ground and surfaces both outside and inside offices, businesses, residential buildings. So, some of the materials that were in period 1 was the dust from the pulverization of the building and jet fuel fires. Then the period number 2 was the settled dust, jet fuel, and other burning materials. Phase number 3 was dust, burning debris and fuels, diesel emissions, burning debris and fuels, and more diesel. No. Phase 4 was burning debris and fuels and more diesel emissions. And phase 5 was settled dust smoke, resuspended dust, cleaning activities, and fumes from diesel emissions. This is just a health disaster. Just a disaster. I hope that they're still studying the effects of this exposure to the collapse to this day. They probably are, but I want to see like how it affects those who, let's say, had a child after September 11th, or did it alter your DNA? Like, are the health issues going to show up maybe 40 years after September 11th? Because today is 22 years, so will it show up like 40 years after? I don't know. But yeah, that's what I've read so far. And I just had to put it down. It's very stressful reading about September 11th every year. But I still learn so much more about it. I have a newer appreciation for people who helped other people that day, who risked their lives and sacrificed their lives in order for others to live their lives. There was a lady I talked to recently I called her on a health line, and she was supposed to be in the towers that day, but she either missed her hair appointment or she called to reschedule her hair appointment, and that's why she wasn't there. And she didn't believe in anything at that time, but after that day, she converted to Catholicism and she moved away to like Florida. But everybody has some type of story, whether they were there or whether they weren't there that day. And even though it's been, 22 years, as time passes, it's still good to reflect on what better ways to handle certain situations, signs to prevent things from happening again, having closure, healing, creating more peace in the world. Personally, the more I read about 9/11, the more I feel like it was more of a global collaboration of terror than just like one segment of terror. Like, it's just too much. There's just too many coincidences. Not trying to sound like a conspiracy theorist or anything, but every year, like this morning, I like to watch the reading of the names, and I see it almost as a televised libation statement where you're just paying homage to your ancestors and those who came before you, those who lost their lives, and keeping their names alive. And I just wonder what it will be like when the last person who remembers and the last person who will say the names, will we still be saying their names no matter how many years pass? As time moves forward, sometimes people become detached from certain events, historical events, because they were born after. Like, if you watch the reading of the names, you'll see some children that will be reading the names of their relatives, and they were born years and years after it happened. Like, they might be 10 years old reading it, and they don't know this person. They weren't alive during that time, but they're still keeping it alive. I wasn't alive during Pearl Harbor or the atomic bomb, but there are people who still have memories of that. There are people who still survived of that. And just because decades have passed doesn't make it any less important. There's a lesson to learn from everything, especially with September 11th. Even on a personal level, just how to protect yourself during a disaster. Knowing the hazards that could come from any type of situation, whether it's a natural disaster or a man-made disaster. And not being so trustworthy of of people, you know. I'm not saying be a conspiracy theorist, but a lot of people did lose their lives that day just by listening, just by giving their power to an authority figure, whether that authority figure was some intercom saying, go back to your freaking office, or the television saying, oh, you can go outside, oh, the air is clean. Use common sense, please. Please. Learn to navigate this world with common sense and protect yourself. Also, just follow in the footsteps of heroes. Every year when I think about 9/11, I think about the first responders and how brave they were. They honestly didn't have to put their lives at risk to save so many people. They knew they were going to die, and they went up there anyway. They knew they were going to die, and they took their time to try to take control of a situation that they knew they would never be able to control. So one good thing that stands out that day is just how much people care about one another. Even though, like, in this day and age, it might seem like everybody's against each other. But I still think deep down, people actually still care about one another. Because anytime there's some type of disaster, if you look at the videos of wherever the disaster is, there's always somebody saving somebody else. There's always somebody going out on the ledge to help another person and not think about themselves. One song that I'd like to dedicate for this year, for this September 11th Memorial Book Review, is Sacrifice by Creed, which ironically came out the same year of 9/11. Every time I think of songs related to 9/11, I think of My Sacrifice by Creed. And I'd encourage you to listen to that song. It's very good. I think they also performed it at the Super Bowl in honor of the first responders. But yeah, I can't wait to finish this book. I'm learning so much about science. I'm going into this new level of like, okay, now it's time to really get down to the nitty-gritty, understand biology, understand chemistry, all of these different things, so that I can look at something and truly, I guess, put it in layman's terms. Because if I understand it, I can help others to understand it. So thank you, Paul James Loy, for writing this book. Rest in peace. Thank you for all of your work. You completed it even when people wanted to criticize you or stop you from finding out more information. This will be valuable for generations to come. So that's all I have to say for now, everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and remember to love and care about one another. Bye-bye.